Abused horse refuses to let new owner leave, and what happens next is unbelievable. Sarah Coleman stood frozen in the muddy paddock, her heart pounding against her ribs. The massive black stallion before her, scarred and skeletal, had pinned her against the fence. Not with aggression, but with a desperate, almost human neediness that took her breath away. Every time she tried to step away, he would shift his body to block her path, his dark eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her hands tremble. This wasn't how she'd planned to spend her retirement savings. After 30 years of teaching elementary school, she dreamed of traveling the world, not standing in a neglect case auction at the county fairgrounds. But something about the Facebook post had called to her. Perhaps it was the stallion's eyes in the grainy evidence photos, or maybe it was simply that she recognized the look of someone who'd given up on trust. "Ma'am," the county sheriff called from beyond the fence, "you don't have to go through with the purchase. That horse, well, he's been through hell. Previous owners facing felony charges might be kinder to—" He left the sentence hanging, but Sarah knew what he meant. Cases like this often ended with euthanasia when no one stepped forward. The stallion, officially listed as County Seizure Number 4, but dubbed Shadow in her mind, lowered his head until his forehead pressed against her shoulder. His breath was warm against her coat, his matted mane falling in ropes around a neck that bore the scars of a too-tight chain. Up close, she could count every rib, see the proud arch of his neck despite his condition, and notice how his muscles trembled with the effort of standing. "He's not going anywhere," Sarah called back, her voice stronger than she felt. "And neither am I." The sheriff shook his head but began the paperwork process. As he walked away, Sarah heard him mutter something about city folks and wild ideas. But she didn't care. She'd seen something in Shadow that morning that changed everything. Not during the bidding, which had been mercifully brief since no one wanted a dangerous stallion, but after, when she'd entered the pen. Instead of the aggressive display she'd been warned about, Shadow had walked straight up to her, ignoring the offered treat in her hand, and simply stayed. The longer she stood there, the closer he pressed, until it became clear that he wasn't trapping her. He was begging her not to become another in a long line of humans who had walked away. Sarah's mind raced as she stood there, mentally reorganizing her life. The small hobby farm she'd inherited from her aunt would need work. Real work, not the casual gardening she'd planned for her retirement. The barn was solid but would need cleaning, the fences needed checking, and she had absolutely no idea how to care for a horse, let alone one with Shadow's history. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably her daughter Lisa, calling again to talk her out of this crazy retirement plan. Lisa had been pushing for a condo in Florida, something safe and sensible. Looking at Shadow's countless scars and the way he flinched at sudden movements while still refusing to leave her side, Sarah realized that safe and sensible had left the building the moment she'd seen his photo. "Okay, boy," she whispered, slowly raising her hand to his neck. He tensed but didn't move away. "We're both starting over. You're not alone anymore." Her fingers found a spot beneath his tangled mane that made him lean into her touch, probably the first gentle contact he'd had in years. "But you're going to have to let me leave long enough to bring the trailer around." As if understanding her words, Shadow's ears pricked forward. He took a single step back, not far, just enough to let her move while keeping her within reach of his muzzle. The intelligence in his eyes made her throat tight. This wasn't just a broken animal. This was a soul who had endured unimaginable cruelty and somehow maintained enough hope to try one more time. The sheriff returned with a stack of papers, explaining the conditions of ownership for a seized animal. Mandatory veterinary checks, no resale for at least 2 years, documentation of proper care. Sarah signed everything without really reading it. Her attention split between the legal requirements and the way Shadow tracked her every movement, as if afraid she'd disappear if he looked away. "There's a good veterinarian about 20 minutes from your place," the sheriff mentioned, his gruff tone softening slightly. "Dr. Martinez. She specializes in rehabilitation cases. You're going to need help, Mrs. Coleman. A lot of it." Sarah nodded, already adding the vet's number to her phone. "Whatever he needs," she said simply. Shadow chose that moment to bump her shoulder gently with his nose, and she couldn't help but smile. We'll figure it out together. As she finally stepped away to get her trailer, Shadow let out a soft, worried whicker. Sarah turned back one last time, meeting those intelligent eyes. I promise, she said clearly, I'm coming back. For the first time that day, the tension in Shadow's posture eased slightly, as if he too was ready to believe in new beginnings. The first night was the hardest. After a white-knuckle drive home with precious cargo in tow, Sarah faced the daunting task of introducing Shadow to his new home. The old barn loomed in the falling dusk, its weathered red paint barely visible in the dim light of her truck's headlamps. Shadow's hooves clanged anxiously against the trailer floor as she positioned it near the barn entrance. Easy, boy, she murmured, though her own hands shook as she prepared to unload him. Dr. Martinez, the vet the sheriff had recommended, had agreed to meet them there, her truck already parked in the gravel driveway. The woman's calm presence was reassuring, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was in way over her head. Mrs. Coleman, Dr. Martinez said quietly, stepping forward with a lead rope. Let's take this slow. He's had enough trauma for one day. The vet was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her mid-30s, with kind eyes and the confident movements of someone who understood frightened animals. Based on his behavior at the auction, he's strongly bonded to you already. That's both good and challenging. He might panic if he loses sight of you. As if to prove her point, Shadow began pawing frantically at the trailer floor when Sarah stepped away to open the ramp. The hollow drumming of his hooves echoed through the darkening farm, making Sarah's heart race. She hurried back into his line of sight, and the drumming stopped immediately. See what I mean? Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. In abuse cases, especially long-term ones, horses can develop intense attachment to the first person who shows them kindness. It's a survival mechanism. She paused, checking her phone. I've reviewed the seizure reports. 3 years of neglect, possibly longer. Used for illegal racing before that, based on the old scars. Sarah felt tears threatening as Shadow finally backed carefully down the ramp, his eyes never leaving her face. In the harsh beam of the barn lights, his condition looked even worse. Patches of hair missing from his dull coat, an old injury making him favor his left hind leg slightly, ribs casting shadows across his sunken flanks. We'll need to start slow with his feeding, Dr. Martinez explained as they led Shadow into the freshly bedded stall Sarah had prepared. His system won't handle rich feed yet. Small, frequent meals, lots of good quality hay. She continued outlining a recovery plan, but Sarah was distracted by Shadow's reaction to his new space. The stallion was methodically touching everything with his muzzle, the water bucket, the hay rack, the smooth wooden walls. When he reached the deeply bedded floor, he looked almost confused, pawing gently at the fresh straw. Sarah realized with a jolt that he might never have had proper bedding before. He'll need daily care for those wounds, Dr. Martinez was saying, pointing out various injuries that needed attention. And we'll have to monitor that leg carefully. But honestly, she smiled slightly, I've seen that look before. When they choose their person like this, they fight to heal. They have a reason to try. As if sensing they were talking about him, Shadow lifted his head from his exploration and nickered softly at Sarah. Without thinking, she stepped into the stall, her hand finding that spot beneath his mane that he seemed to love. For a moment, they stood in perfect stillness, two beings beginning to trust in something new. The moment was broken by Sarah's phone ringing. Lisa again. Dr. Martinez tactfully stepped away to prepare medication, leaving Sarah to face her daughter's concerns. Mom, please tell me you didn't actually buy that horse. Lisa's worried voice came through clearly. Mrs. Jenkins next door called me, said she saw a horse trailer in your driveway. You don't know anything about horses? I'm learning, Sarah replied, watching as Shadow discovered the hay net, his movements still cautious but increasingly curious. And I have help. There's a wonderful vet here right now. That's not the point. Lisa's frustration was palpable. You're supposed to be retiring, taking it easy, not taking on some dangerous rescue animal. What if it hurts you? What about your plans to travel? To visit the grandkids? Shadow's ears flicked toward Sarah's voice, and he abandoned his hay to press his head against her shoulder, now a familiar gesture that made her smile despite her daughter's words. The grandkids can visit here, she said firmly. And as for travel, sometimes life has other plans for us, sweetheart. Better plans. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Finally, Lisa sighed. You're really doing this, aren't you? I really am. Sarah stroked Shadow's neck, feeling the strong pulse of life beneath her fingers. Come visit us. See for yourself. He's special, Lisa. Sometimes you just know when something is meant to be. After ending the call, Sarah turned to find Dr. Martinez watching them thoughtfully. You know, the vet said, most people would have walked away. Taking on a horse like this, especially as a first-time owner, it's a huge commitment. Sarah looked at Shadow, who had returned to delicately picking at his hay, though he kept glancing back to check that she was still there. Walking away wasn't an option, she said simply, not after he asked me to stay. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as predictable as Shadow's heartbeat. Sarah woke before dawn each morning, her aging muscles protesting the new routine, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. She would find Shadow waiting for her, his dark eyes brightening at her approach, his nickering welcome becoming more confident each day. Progress came in small victories. The first time Shadow dozed off while she groomed him, his lower lip drooping and his ears relaxed, Sarah had to stop brushing to wipe away tears. Dr. Martinez had explained that sleeping deeply was a sign of trust, something Shadow had clearly been unable to do for years. Now watching him dream in the morning sun, Sarah saw another piece of his damaged soul beginning to heal. He's gaining weight nicely, Dr. Martinez commented during one of her regular visits, running expert hands along Shadow's improving frame. And look at his coat, starting to get that healthy shine back. The vet stepped back, making notes on her tablet. But what really impresses me is his emotional progress. You've done amazing work with him, Sarah. Sarah couldn't help but beam with pride, though she deflected the praise. He's doing all the hard work. I'm just here to... She was interrupted by Shadow deliberately reaching over and pulling her sun hat off, a playful gleam in his eye that would have been unimaginable just weeks ago. And apparently to serve as his entertainment, she finished, laughing as she retrieved her hat. Dr. Martinez smiled. That right there, that playfulness, that's a horse who's remembering how to be a horse again, not just surviving but living. She hesitated, then added, I think it's time we talked about the next step in his rehabilitation. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it easier. Shadow needed to learn to accept other people. He couldn't remain attached solely to her. It wasn't healthy for him, and if anything ever happened to her, she pushed that thought away, focusing on the present. I've got a colleague, Dr. Martinez continued, a horse behaviorist who specializes in trauma cases. She'd like to work with Shadow, help him build confidence with other handlers. It would be a gradual process, completely at his pace. As if sensing the serious turn of conversation, Shadow pressed close to Sarah's side, his familiar warmth both comforting and concerning. What if he wasn't ready? What if trying to push him too fast undid all their careful progress? Her worried thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car coming up the driveway. Shadow's ears pricked forward, but he didn't show his former panic at unexpected visitors. Another small victory. Sarah recognized Lisa's SUV, and her heart lifted. Her daughter had finally taken her up on the invitation to visit. What happened next would forever remain etched in Sarah's memory. Lisa stepped out of her car, her movements cautious, clearly nervous about the huge black horse standing beside her mother. But it was the small figure who burst from the back seat that changed everything. Careful, Emily, Lisa called out, but her 8-year-old daughter was already running toward the fence, her face glowing with excitement. Sarah started to step forward, instinctively moving to intercept her granddaughter, but Shadow's reaction stopped her in her tracks. The stallion, who had been so fearful of strangers, who still sometimes spooked at sudden movements, lifted his head high and let out a soft, gentle nicker, a sound Sarah had only ever heard him make to her. Then, to everyone's amazement, he walked calmly to the fence where Emily stood and lowered his head to her level. "Oh, Grandma," Emily breathed, her small hand reaching out but stopping just short of touching him. showing an instinctive understanding of the moment's delicacy. He's beautiful. Sarah watched, tears flowing freely now, as Shadow very gently touched his muzzle to Emily's outstretched hand. Lisa had come to stand beside her, both of them holding their breath as they witnessed something extraordinary. "Mom," Lisa whispered, "I was so wrong. I see it now. What you saw in him." Shadow stayed perfectly still, letting Emily stroke his face with wonder in her eyes. When he finally lifted his head, he looked back at Sarah with such pride, such joy that she could almost hear him saying, "See, I can be brave. I can trust again." Dr. Martinez, who had been watching silently, wiped her own eyes. "Well," she said softly, "I think we just found our answer about his readiness for the next step. Sometimes the best healers come in unexpected packages." As Emily chattered excitedly about her new friend, asking a million questions about his care, Sarah saw Shadow's future unfolding in a new way. He wouldn't just heal, he would thrive. And maybe, just maybe, he would help others heal too. "Do you think," Emily asked hopefully, "I could come visit him again?" Sarah looked at Lisa, who nodded with a watery smile. "I think," Sarah replied, watching Shadow's gentle interactions with her granddaughter, "that would make Shadow very happy indeed." News travels fast in small towns. Within a month of Emily's first visit, Sarah began receiving unexpected inquiries. It started with a call from the local elementary school counselor, asking if she'd heard about equine therapy. Then came the mother of an autistic child who'd seen Emily at the grocery store, excitedly talking about her grandmother's special horse. Sarah stood in Shadow's paddock, watching him demonstrate yet another side of his remarkable personality. A 12-year-old boy named Marcus, who hadn't spoken since his father's death 6 months ago, sat quietly in a chair near the fence. Shadow, displaying his newfound confidence, was gentle in his approach, stopping several feet away and gradually moving closer as the boy's tension eased. "He's reading that child like a book," whispered Anna, the horse behaviorist Dr. Martinez had recommended. After seeing Shadow's interaction with Emily, they'd adjusted their approach. Instead of formal training sessions, Anna visited to observe and guide these carefully arranged meetings. "Notice how he lowers his head whenever Marcus shows signs of anxiety? That's emotional intelligence you can't teach." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Shadow had come so far from the terrified, skeletal creature who'd pinned her against a fence, desperate for connection. Now he was offering that same lifeline to others, seeming to instinctively understand what each visitor needed. The breakthrough came when Shadow delicately lipped at Marcus's sleeve, making the boy's lips twitch in an almost smile. Then, to everyone's amazement, Marcus whispered something so soft they almost missed it. "Hi, horse." Sarah caught Anna's eye, seeing her own joy reflected there. But before either could speak, a commotion at the farm entrance drew their attention. A police car was pulling up, followed by Dr. Martinez's truck. Sarah's heart jumped. Had something happened? Was there a problem with Shadow's custody? "Stay with Marcus," Anna murmured, already moving to intercept the visitors. Sarah watched as Dr. Martinez and the sheriff spoke quietly with Anna, their expressions serious. Shadow, showing his protective nature, positioned himself between the newcomers and Marcus, though his ears remained relaxed, showing no signs of his former fear of uniforms. After what seemed like an eternity, Anna returned. "Sarah," she said softly, "they need to speak with you. It's about Shadow's former owner." The next hour passed in a blur. The sheriff explained that they'd finally located more of Shadow's history through DNA testing and racing records. His former owner, facing multiple charges, was trying to negotiate a plea deal by revealing the locations of other abused horses. But he had one condition. He wanted to make a statement to Shadow's new owner. "You don't have to do this," Dr. Martinez said firmly, seeing Sarah's distress. "Shadow is legally yours. Nothing can change that." Sarah looked over at the paddock, where Marcus had actually stood up and was running his fingers through Shadow's mane, the horse standing perfectly still for the tentative touch. "What exactly does he want to say?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Says he has information about Shadow's early life. Claims the horse was a champion before everything." Wants to explain himself, I guess. But like the doc said, you don't owe him anything. Sarah felt a familiar warmth as Shadow, sensing her turmoil, left Marcus's side to press his head against her shoulder. The gesture, once born of desperate need, had evolved into one of mutual support. Looking into those wise, gentle eyes, Sarah made her decision. I'll listen to what he has to say, she said firmly, but on one condition. Every cent he got from selling those other horses' locations, it goes to their rehabilitation, and he never gets to know how well Shadow's doing now. He lost that right. The sheriff nodded, respect evident in his expression. I'll make it happen. And Sarah, what you've done here, he gestured to where Marcus had followed Shadow and was now speaking quietly to the horse, forming his first full sentences in months. It's something special. Later that evening, after Marcus left with his tearfully grateful mother, Sarah sat in her usual spot on the mounting block while Shadow grazed nearby. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a daily show that never failed to bring her peace. Your past is your past, sweet boy, she told Shadow softly. But your future? That's something beautiful we're building together. Shadow lifted his head, grass stalks dangling from his lips, and nickered his agreement. In the distance, Sarah's phone buzzed with another message. More inquiries about visits, about hope, about healing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new souls needing what Shadow had to offer. But for now, in this moment, they had everything they needed. Trust, love, and the quiet understanding between two beings who had helped each other find their true purpose. 1 year to the day after Sarah first met Shadow at the county auction, she sat at her kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating photographs spread across the wooden surface. A stark before and after journey that still took her breath away. The first photos, taken by county officials, showed a broken creature with dull eyes and protruding ribs. Beside them lay recent pictures, Shadow gleaming in the sunlight, his black coat sheened with health, his eyes bright with intelligence and joy. But it was the images between these extremes that told the real story. There was Shadow with Emily, her small hand reaching up to feed him a carrot, while Lisa looked on with proud tears. Marcus standing tall beside the stallion, reading aloud from his favorite book during one of his weekly visits. A group photo of the first official therapy session, with Shadow gentle and attentive to each participant's needs. Each picture captured a moment of healing, not just Shadow's, but everyone he touched. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention outdoors, where Anna was leading a morning session. Shadow moved with graceful purpose through a small group of veterans, part of a new PTSD program they'd started. His ability to sense anxiety and offer silent support had proven remarkable, especially with those who struggled with traditional therapy. Easy there, big fellow, one of the veterans called out as Shadow paused to investigate his wheelchair. Sarah smiled, remembering how they'd worried about Shadow's reaction to mobility devices. Instead, he'd shown an almost uncanny gentleness, carefully navigating around wheels and walkers, offering his solid presence to those who needed extra support. The paperwork before her represented the next big step, official certification as a therapy facility. Dr. Martinez had been instrumental in making it happen, connecting them with the right organizations and vouching for Shadow's exceptional abilities. What had started as one horse's rescue had grown into something far more profound. Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from Emily, filled with emojis. Grandma, can't wait for tomorrow's Junior Volunteer Day. Shadow promised to help me teach the new kids about proper grooming. And the fact that her granddaughter spoke of Shadow making promises brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Emily had developed such a bond with him that she now talked about pursuing a career in veterinary medicine. You and Shadow opened my eyes, she told Sarah recently. I want to help heal animals like him. A knock at the door interrupted her reminiscence. It was the sheriff making one of his occasional visits. He'd become a supporter of their program, often referring families in need of healing to what the locals now called Shadow's Safe Haven. Quite a difference from last year, he said, nodding toward the paddock where Shadow was now demonstrating his favorite trick, gently removing hats from unsuspecting visitors. The veteran's laughter carried across the morning air. Had my doubts that day, I'll admit. Never been happier to be wrong. Sarah offered him coffee, and they sat watching the session through the window. "Got some news you should hear," the sheriff said finally. "Shadow's former owner's case concluded yesterday. Judge took our recommendation. He'll be serving time, and every cent from the information he provided is going to horse rescue organizations." "How many?" Sarah asked softly, knowing he'd understand. 17 horses saved from similar conditions, 3 of them already adopted by good families. He paused, then added, "You and Shadow, you started something here. Showed people what's possible when you give love a chance." After the sheriff left, Sarah walked out to the paddock. The therapy session had ended, and Shadow broke away from Anna to meet her at the gate, his greeting nicker as warm as ever. His eyes, once filled with desperate fear, now held a wisdom and peace that touched everyone who met him. "Ready for your afternoon appointment?" she asked him, running her fingers through his now silky mane. They had a new visitor coming, a young girl who hadn't spoken since witnessing a tragic accident. Her parents had heard about Shadow from Marcus's mother, hoping for a similar miracle. Shadow's gentle bump against her shoulder was answer enough, as if he knew exactly what his role was in the world now: to pass on the healing he'd received, to show others that trust was possible, that love could overcome the deepest wounds. Later that evening, as the sun set on another day of small miracles, Sarah added a new photo to her collection. In it, Shadow stood in his paddock, surrounded by the day's visitors, veterans, children, families, all drawn to his gentle spirit. His head was raised proudly, his eyes bright with purpose, every inch of him radiating the peace he'd found. Below it, she wrote a simple caption: "Sometimes the ones who have been hurt the most have the most love to give." Shadow's legacy isn't just his own healing, it's the healing he brings to others. From unwanted rescue to beloved healer, he reminds us daily that it's never too late for a new beginning. And in the growing dusk, as if to underline her words, Shadow's soft nicker echoed across the farm. No longer a cry for help, but a song of hope, an invitation to all who needed healing to find their way home to Shadow's safe haven.